What is up, my beautiful gemstones? Welcome back to my channel, and if you're new here, just welcome. My name is Gemma Jade, but today we are going to be discussing UFO encounters on the battlefields. It's no secret that unless you're actively involved in the military and have been actually fighting in a war, that there are things we as regular civilians not only don't know about, but that we never even consider in the first place. In every war, at least as far back as what I could find in my research, there have oftentimes been lesser known experiences that soldiers and other people have had while out there on the battlefield beyond the typical tales of death and heroism. I found in the background of these things, of the wars and the fighting and all that comes along with those things as a whole, that there are oftentimes accounts that are seemingly somewhat outlandish, of strange things happening that are possibly even more terrifying, or at the very least, very much more unknown than the enemy or enemies themselves. There have been for centuries, and probably for as far back as war existed, weird things lurking around and loitering up in the skies above battlefields, and I thought that today would be a good day to talk about some of those things, those encounters here with you all. I'm not talking about things that were merely ancient civilizations being ignorant of now very recognizable and known celestial phenomena, and it also isn't about anything in the realm of superstition either. Let's look at some of the stranger encounters I've found throughout my research into this subject that were happening across the world and all over and above many battlefields to date. Let's jump right in. So real quick before we get started, I just want to say that if you guys like this video, let me know, because I could have done 5 of these. That's how many encounters I found in my research about this type of phenomenon. Also, I'm going to be covering extraterrestrials on battlefields because that happens so much more than I think anyone actually thinks of, including myself. I couldn't believe it when I saw those encounters, but I found them after I had already been researching this for a few months, so that's what's going to come next if you guys are vocal and let me know that you'd like something like that. So in jumping right in, let's start with World War I and that time the Red Baron supposedly shot down a UFO or flying saucer as they were more commonly known back then. The so-called Red Baron was a German ace military pilot whose real name was Manfred Freyer von Richthofen, and it's known how he was not only admired but also feared for his flying and piloting skills that to this day some people still say go unrivaled. He has come to be known as the Ace of Aces, and he's gained 80 air combat victories during his wartime career. Nigel Watson mentioned the Red Baron in his book, UFOs of the First World War, and in the book, the mention is about how this particular pilot didn't only hunt down human opponents or enemies in the air or in the skies. So according to the story in that book, and what's come to be the most common retelling of it, it was the spring of 1917 when the Baron was flying over the Belgium trenches with a fellow pilot named Peter Waitsrick when he spotted an unidentified object that was described as, quote, an upside-down silver saucer with orange lights, end quote, that were hovering in the clear blue skies with them. The men sat for a moment watching in wonder and in awe, and probably with a little trepidation and fear there too, until suddenly and without warning, the Baron opened fire on the object. Peter Waitsrick, who was there and witnessed the whole event, said of what happened next, quote, we were terrified because we'd never seen anything like it before. The Baron immediately opened fire and the thing went down like a rock, shearing off tree limbs as it crashed into the woods, end quote. That's not the end of the story though, guys. And things got even stranger after all of that happened. As the two men passed over the wreckage, they saw 2 humanoid figures climb out of the wrecked otherworldly craft. The humanoids immediately took off and ran to hide among the trees and were never seen by the 2 men or anyone else seemingly ever again. No one else reported any incidents at that time in that place regarding either the humanoids or the craft. Peter Waitsrick kept the whole bizarre tale to himself for more than 80 years, but in 1999, he decided to tell the world about it and went public with what happened that day. Some people look to the fact that he decided to open up after 80 years of silence to the Weekly World News of all things, because it's not really the most reputable source for anything, let alone something so massive that he was trying to inform the world of. But I really believe that picking little things like that apart would be a mistake here, because at the end of the day, there's no reason to be quiet all that time with such a sensational story, except for if you're experiencing some fear surrounding it. That's just my opinion, though. Come for me if you want to. And listen, who cares if he got paid for it? People are like, oh, he only came out because he needed money. What? 80-something years later? I don't know. I guess it could be said that in 1999, he knew if he came up with something like that, he could profit. But seriously, he had to have been, what, almost 100 at the time? If he was silent for more than 80 years, and I think it was 82 years, and let's say he had to have been at least 15 when he started flying, then he had to have been close to 100 with nothing to lose about coming forward, right? Another thing I should mention here before the skeptics have a field day with me in the comments is that the plane Weitzrick claimed he and the Baron had been at the time were a type of plane that didn't start being used until August of 1917, which would have been several months after he alleges the whole situation took place. Here's the thing. He was old, okay? And I'm sure his memory was maybe a little bit confused. I don't think at all that this one detail should make the whole story null and void. What do you guys think about that, though? Let me know in the comments below, please, as always. I wonder if maybe he just didn't think anyone other than that news source would really take him seriously because they were known for reporting things like that and sensationalizing them. The plane should be insignificant because it had nothing to do with what actually happened to them. And think about almost 100 years of memories in someone's mind who's been through a war and God only knows what else, and then trying to pinpoint something so small and minute when something so huge has just happened to you, something which you are more than likely swore you'd never speak about, and that also maybe gave you a bit of trauma. So I believe the him stating that it was a different plane than could have possibly been used is a null and void detail. Like, does not compute for me why that's an issue. All in all, and all that to say, I believe his story and think that he and the Baron definitely did see something that day. They're lucky whatever they fired on didn't fire back, though, and that's for sure, as we're going to see in the coming encounters. The source material was a little ambiguous here, but I believe it was the person writing the article who said, quote, "There's no doubt in my mind that the Baron shot down some kind of spacecraft from another planet, and those little guys who ran off into the woods were space aliens of some kind," end quote. It could have been Peter Weitzrick who said that, though. It wasn't clear, and I'm not sure, so just so y'all know. That encounter probably wasn't the first, and it definitely wasn't the last one to be had during World War I. That's when the whole quote-unquote flaming onion thing started. Most of you probably know what that means, but I certainly didn't. And for those of you that have no idea what I'm talking about, let me explain. So the flaming onions are described as these glowing green balls of light that would zip around in the sky, doing all sorts of aerial maneuvers, including dips and flips, etc. And they would often chase other airplanes and crafts in the sky, like the military aerial vehicles. The flaming onions would not only chase them, but often far outpace and outmaneuver the other military planes and things easily. And it was almost like whatever they were, whoever was in control of them, were merely having some fun with the human pilots that were involved. The onions never attacked anyone, they were never overly aggressive either, and that's what leads me to believe that they were merely playing with the humans, as I've come to find that many extraterrestrials will do when given the proper chance. This odd and very strange phenomenon was reported by both sides of the war and wasn't just unique to one side or the other. Those who did experience it, again, regardless of what side they were fighting on, were absolutely terrified by the encounters and no doubt had no idea what to do with the information they had. It wasn't like they could just go on the internet and talk about it like we're fortunate enough to be able to do today. And back then, you really took big risks with your personal and professional life and livelihood if you spoke publicly about something like this, no matter if it was absolutely real and the truth or not. And also, most of the time, no matter how many other people had seen it as well, it didn't matter. I mean, you'd have to get the other people to be willing to take those risks to back you up. And like I said, it was hard enough just to get one person to admit it, let alone a whole group of soldiers and military men. So there is a theory about what these so-called flaming onions were, and that's that they were flares that had been fired by the Germans. But let's be real here and keep in mind that the Germans were also encountering them. Not to mention, flares don't actively chase aircraft with seasoned pilots in them who would have easily been able to recognize what a flare looked like compared to what they were actually seeing. There's still a very bizarre, unexplained mystery of that war. So besides weird lights and flying saucers, there's even more reports of other strange and peculiar phenomena surrounding wars and battlefields throughout the centuries. Still focusing on World War I, let's talk about another very mystifying aerial phenomena that started when a man called Lieutenant Frederick Ardsley was patrolling in northern France sometime in the morning on January 9th, 1918. As he flew happily along, just going about his usual business, another biplane, one that was the exact same make and model as the one he was currently flying, flew up next to him and positioned itself to where they were somewhat flying in tandem. This wasn't the most unusual thing in the world, so at first he didn't think anything more about it. But when he looked over to see who was flying the neighboring craft, that's when he got a huge shock and realized that something sus was definitely going on. The person in the cockpit of the other plane wasn't anyone like who he expected them to be. There was a woman there, and he said she was absolutely stunning, beautiful. She had long flowing blonde hair, and she blew him a kiss, and then did what was described as, quote, a can-can dance, end quote, right there in the cockpit before swiftly flying away from him. Of course, the lieutenant tried to catch up with the woman, and he immediately gave chase to her plane, but it's reported that her skills were, quote, far superior, end quote, and she easily lost him. Even though he was going maximum in what looked to be the same exact craft that she was flying. So do we have, not cloaking, but what is it called? Like she was in an ET ship, but made it look like mirroring? Is that what that's called? Let me know in the comments. Guys, this sighting is fairly well known, and the mystery woman has been given two interesting nicknames that have stuck with her throughout the years. She's come to be known as either the Valkyrie or Lady Sopwith. She's also become an absolute legend, and no one really knows who she was or what business she had with Frederick that day. I feel like she was just playing with him. As I mentioned earlier, ETs really do like to mess with us sometimes, the lighthearted, high vibrating ones. I see it all the time in my research and just in talking to people who have encountered ETs randomly. With that being said, though, before I would even attempt to make any sort of generalization about whether I believe this encounter or not, I would have to know more about the lieutenant and his personal life, how he was known to be as far as his temperament. Was he married? Was he mean? Was he nice? Was he known to be honest, etc.? So I'll just leave it up for you gemstones to decide whether or not the kissing can-can girl encounter happened or if it's all just another wartime myth. Let's take into consideration for a moment that maybe ETs are just attracted to our wars for some reason. And there is a lot of interesting evidence out there that shows they really are. Specifically, our nuclear power, but we can talk about that another time in another video if y'all want to. With thinking about that along those lines, I want to discuss one of, if not the most massive, then objectively the greatest, at least in that sense, war of all time. I'm speaking, of course, of World War II. It was no great surprise to me that aliens were said to be drawn to it as well. On November 27th, 1944, Lieutenant Fred Ringwald of the U.S. Air Force was riding as an observer on a nighttime operation over the Rhine Valley, which is just north of Strasbourg on the French-German border, when he saw something very strange in the sky. He was there to observe, and I suppose that's just what he did. The lieutenant saw something in the sky that was very much out of place and that wasn't supposed to be there. It was in the distance some, over a little hill, a little bit ahead of them, but below them as well, if that makes sense. And I don't know anything about being a pilot, so it confused me a little, but I know it was up ahead of them. So over that hill in the distance, there were 10 lights all in a row, glowing a fiery and bright orange color. And when he pointed them out to everyone on his team that night, they all suddenly very easily saw the lights too. The men checked with the Allied ground radar, but there was nothing coming up. And I reiterate, there was nothing that was supposed to be there at all. They were supposed to be the only ones flying in the area at that time. The men were all discussing whether or not to engage the strange lights, but as they did so, the lights just dematerialized into nothing and were no longer visible. But it wasn't like they kind of shut off. Like, it wasn't like someone flicked a switch. It was just like they were there and then they weren't. The men were rightfully upset and very confused. The lights definitely hadn't belonged to any aircraft known to any of them, and these were seasoned military pilots. There was no way it was a random normal plane that they just had some trouble recognizing for what it was. They said no way, and I tend to believe them. It defied rational explanation, and that's probably why they kept it to themselves for a very long time. Now, Lieutenant Ringwald and his crew were a part of a unit of the United States Air Force called the 415th Special Operations Squadron. This squadron was formed in 1943 with the specific task of carrying out missions in the Mediterranean theater of operations, and later on they would be in the northeastern Europe area during World War II. Just as the name somewhat suggests, the unit was involved in carrying out nighttime missions and operations, so they were in a really good position to notice when something wasn't quite right in the skies. They particularly were in the area of the Rhine Valley, and there were a ton of pilots at that time who were all coming forward, very bravely, if I do say so myself, to report seeing the same types of lights that the men saw that night in November. This went on for a long time. Sometimes the lights were orange, sometimes red, and even green ones were seen just hovering and shining in a line of 8 or 10 each, and every time a report came in. So everyone saw 8 or 10 glowing red, orange, or green lights in a row hovering and then not there anymore. The lights were described as being cigar-shaped with no visible propulsion system or wings, and they were easily maneuverable and very, very fast. They were separate ships, each light, so the 8 or 10 of them would cluster together and fly in formation without ever one showing up on any radar system. The lights, or whoever was piloting the ships attached to them, were playful figures and seemed to just enjoy messing with the pilots, other military men, and human beings. One of the things they did the most was to go up right next to the humans' plane, pace them for a moment or so, and then take off at incredibly inhuman and unexplainable speeds. Then they would simply vanish into thin air, and no one has ever been able to figure out what they were or what their purpose was in being there. Guys, I just don't believe that this many reports would come in from such trustworthy, reputable sources, some of them not even knowing that the other or anyone else were seeing the same things, just for it to end up being some kind of military myth or some sort of elaborate prank on the public who would eventually find out about it, right? Because we were bound to find out. So if people are reporting these things, why would they do so if they weren't seeing them? It just makes no sense to me. I've got a direct quote from one of the very puzzled airmen who witnessed the lights firsthand. He said about it, quote, "I was flying and there was an object next to me. I couldn't get rid of it. I slowed up, it was there. I sped up, it was there. I would dive, it would be there. I turned to starboard and 2 balls of fire turned with me. I turned to the port side and they turned with me. We were going 260 miles an hour and the balls were keeping up with me. I called. Nothing on radar," end quote. Once again, we have something that defied rational explanation, and many of the people involved started whispering that what they were seeing and what was going on was not of this world. It seemed like very suddenly reports started pouring in from all over the European theater of war, and some still say, at least in hindsight, that it looked more like War of the Worlds than World War II. I'm getting tongue-tied. So it didn't take long for these lights to be given a name, and they were called Foo Fighters, and now I can rest well at night in my sleepy little head knowing what Foo is, even if I don't understand how you fight it. Never mind, that's an inside joke between Gemma and myself. Anyway, the name was admittedly silly and came from a comic strip called The Smoky Stover. In the strip, the main character's catchphrase was, quote, "As long as there's Foo, there's life," end quote, which makes absolutely zero sense, but of course I love that. And I think that's the whole point, because neither did the lights and what they were and what they represented at the time. We have to take into consideration the reliability of the witnesses and also their air experience. Not to mention the sheer volume of the reports all coming in from near the same place, but from all sorts of different types of sources, most of them respective of one another. And because of all that, an official investigation was eventually launched into the Foo Fighters. So during this investigation, it was first thought that there was some sort of special and top secret German weapon of war, but then the plot thickened and the rabbit hole certainly got deeper when the people started carrying out the investigations. They learned that the enemy pilots were seeing and reporting the exact same lights. Plus, once again, the objects were never threatening and had never attacked or tried to harm anyone at all. They merely played games in the sky with the pilots on both sides. A full investigation was launched and completed, but no official determination has ever been made as to what they were, why they were there, where they came from. We know just as much now about these so-called Foo Fighters as they all did back then, so nothing gained. Theories range from that they were enemy technology, they were some sort of unknown atmospheric phenomenon, or that it was merely the pilots dealing with combat fatigue and seeing things that weren't there. And I really detest that last one. First of all, the enemy wouldn't have been reporting to the enemy that they saw these things if the lights belonged to them. They'd be telling on themselves. Secondly, if it was some sort of strange natural phenomenon, that it's more than likely that by now, at least in 2024 or 2023, we would have figured it out. And last but certainly not least, all of these soldiers, all of those times, separately, respective of one another, completely independent of one another, all reporting the same thing. I don't think I need to say how I feel about that incredibly coincidental theory, so let's move on. Oddly enough, over in the Pacific theater of operations of the war, pilots were also reporting strange things in the sky that did not seem to belong there. This time, though, it was balls of fire just hanging there in the air that were completely and totally obviously out of place. They would hover for a few and then shoot off at astronomically high rates of speed, and then they'd be gone. Theories were thrown around like that they were merely some sort of secret Japanese weapons, so just like the other place where they thought it was the Germans, blaming the enemy. However, the enemy here was also reported seeing the exact same thing, and no one knew what they were. The balls of fire also never behaved in threatening or aggressive manners, never attacked, and seemingly just hovered there in the sky for unknown reasons. They had an intelligence to them, though. Like, they weren't just balls of gas, or I don't know if that makes sense what they would be, but I think you guys understand what I'm saying. But for me, it seems like they were piloted by something or someone, and more than likely it was something otherworldly. So here's the thing. We as the human race is not flying around in any type of specific ship that can be referred to as a ball of fire, right? Nothing that we have, military or otherwise, looks like an actual ball of fire. We would have figured it out by now. In this day and age, we would have been like, oh yeah, back in World War II or whatever, XYZ was happening and it created what looked like these balls of fire in the sky. But no one is saying that because nobody is talking about this at all, except little old me here on YouTube. But most people nowadays do believe that they were some sort of extraterrestrial or alien craft, or who knows, maybe something else altogether. We just don't know. So let's move on. Let's discuss some interesting phenomenon that came out of the battlefields of the Korean War. This war was fought between North and South Korea for 3 years, from 1950 until it ended in 1953. And besides the war itself, there seems to be a whole bunch of soldiers and other military men who saw and witnessed things that are beyond the realm of our own reality still to this day, and which confused them terribly at the time. I imagine they were a little more than terrified as well. The first very bizarre account to come from the Korean War was stated in January of 1987. So it didn't happen in 1987, and this confused me a little bit, obviously, because the war was from 1950 to 1953. But someone came forward in 1987. A man named John Timmerman, who was from the J. Allen Hynek Center for UFO Studies, or SUFOS, sat down to interview a former U.S. Army Private First Class by the name of Mr. Francis P. Wall. Mr. Wall had been deployed with the Army Infantry, 25th Division, 27th Regiment, 2nd Battalion, Easy Company. I have no idea what all that means, but it sounds like this guy was certainly a big deal. Anyways, he said that in May of 1951, his unit was operating just outside of Choron, which was an area the military knew as the Iron Triangle, and they were there on a mission to reach a small village in the mountains. This just occurred to me just now. It didn't occur to me in the research or while writing. Wait until you hear what happened to Wall and his unit. And think about the fact that the place was known as the Iron Triangle. So we have another triangular phenomenon. Bermuda, Bennington, Alaskan, Arizonan, Ireland's Triangle. What did I miss? Put it in the comments. What other triangles are there? So anyway, they were on this mission to reach this small village in the mountains. The area they were looking for was marked as a place that was about to be bombarded by artillery fire, meaning it was about to be blown to smithereens and wiped completely off the map. Wall and his men were desperate to make sure that all of the innocent civilians living in, near, and around that area were properly warned that the attack was coming, and I'm sure they were also equipped for evacuation as well. As they made their way up into the mountain, the air was already reverberating with all of the thumps and booms and random scary noises that meant the shells were already hitting and things were going from bad to desperate for these men. The dark night was occasionally even lit up brightly with flashes of light from the heavy artillery headed the way of the village. So Mr. Wall and his unit made their way to a steep slope that overlooked the village that they were looking for all along, and they realized they might have been too late. They watched on in horror and then in confusion as, quote, the fiery flowers of artillery airbursts painted the scene with fire, end of quote. And then they saw something none of them could ever explain, like in their lives. It was up in the air, hovering high above the already ravaged scene. Mr. Wall said of it, quote, we suddenly noticed on our right-hand side what appeared to be a jack-o'-lantern come wafting down across the mountain. And at first, no one thought anything about it, so we noticed that this thing continued on down to the village to where, indeed, the artillery airbursts were exploding. It had an orange glow in the beginning. We further noticed that this object was so quick that it could get into the center of an airburst of artillery and yet remained unharmed. But then this object approached us, and it turned a blue-green brilliant light. It's hard to distinguish the size of it. There's no way to compare it to anything. The light was pulsating. The object approached us, end quote. The men were more than unsettled as the thing approached them, and they already figured out that not only wasn't it one of theirs, but it was unlikely any known aircraft they had ever seen before on either or any of the sides involved in the war at that time. They immediately and very quickly radioed into their superiors asking for permission to shoot at and open fire on it. So I don't know what was running through any of their heads, but they just literally saw this thing being fired on by things much larger and more damaging than whatever types of guns they had. So I don't know why their first and immediate thought was to fire at it with those guns. And let's be honest, probably were dainty in comparison to everything else that was being thrown at this thing that was not harming it. So that was my initial thought until I read further. Permission was granted, but when he opened fire on the craft, it was with an M1 rifle loaded with armor-piercing bullets. I know that isn't a dainty weapon, but I said what I said. He hit the object several times, but merely heard the sounds of the bullets bouncing off of it easily and casually every single time. The bullets were hitting against something that sounded like it was metal, but here's the thing. I stand corrected because it worked. It worked. The bullets actually started damaging the craft and in turn made it start to behave in an even stranger way than it had been up to that point. Whereas before it was merely, or seemingly so at least, because no one actually knew what it was doing, but it seemed like it was merely trying to protect the village and all of the innocent lives within it from the artillery fire. Anyway, Wall said, quote, now why would that bullet damage this craft if the artillery rounds didn't? Thank you. I don't know, unless they had dropped their protective field around them or whatever, but the object went wild and the light was going on and off. It went off completely once, briefly, and it was merely moving erratically from side to side as though it might crash to the ground. Then, a sound, we had heard no sound previous to this, the sound of like diesel locomotives revving up. That's the way this thing sounded, end quote. So at this point, things got harrowing to say the least. And according to Mr. Wall, the ship unleashed some sort of retaliatory attack on him and his unit, but it wasn't with bullets and it wasn't with artillery fire. The craft was somehow emitting something that looked to the men like a laser beam, but one that would only pulse. The men could see the quote-unquote searchlight weapon aiming for them, looking for them from its place above them in the sky. When the ray finally found them and then swept over them, the men were all overcome with a tingling and a burning sensation throughout their entire bodies. There seemed to be no visible damage or effect that this was having on them, but they nonetheless scrambled for cover, all of them making their way as fast as possible to their bunkers while also trying to stay out of the way of the pulsating searchlight flash beam. The men could feel it penetrating through their skin, regardless of the fact that nobody could physically see any damage being done at all. The pain was almost excruciating and made the men scramble for cover even faster wherever they could find it. Once they got to their bunkers, the attack didn't stop, and instead they were still being retaliated against. Now, before I tell you what Mr. Wall said about whatever this thing was, I would like to say here, respectfully, allegedly, come for me, they were idiots. And I say so with all due respect, but it's like, why in the world would they ever think something like opening fire on that thing was a good idea? It was literally there, very obviously saving people, and was seemingly impervious to the heavy artillery fire in the middle of a war zone. Maybe, and this is just my brain trying to work around all of this, but maybe whatever or whoever was in the craft, they thought that Wall and the men with him that night were the enemy who had been attacking the village in the first place, because think about it. How in the world would whatever was flying that ship know the difference between attack? So did it think they were attacking the village, or that's what they were there for? Because this thing did not attack them until they opened fire on it. Anyway, Wall said about the attack, quote, "So the company commander, Lieutenant Evans, hauled us into our bunkers. We didn't know what was going to happen. We were scared. These are underground dugouts where you have peepholes to look out to fire at the enemy. So I'm in my bunker with another man. We're peeping out at this thing. It hovered over us for a while, lit up the whole area with its light, and then I saw it shoot off at a 45-degree angle. That quick, just there and gone, that quick. And it was as though that was the end of it," end quote. But it wasn't the end of it at all, not even close. Unfortunately for Mr. Wall and the other men, for the next several days, they were all coming down with something, like some crazy symptoms. They developed an array of debilitating symptoms like memory loss, disorientation, stomach aches, nausea, headaches, and extreme weakness and fatigue, and that's just to name a couple of few. The weakness was so strong that most of the men couldn't even walk. These were soldiers, honorable and military men, and yet they couldn't walk. That scares the poop out of me. Of course, they all went to see doctors, but none of the doctors or specialists who examined them were able to come up with any reasons for why they were feeling like they were, or what was happening to their minds and their bodies. There was only one thing that made it evident that anything was even wrong in the first place, and that was that each and every single one of the men had extremely high white blood cell counts. That was all these doctors and all these specialists could find. That's the only thing they had in common across the board that could explain what was going on with them, even though they still didn't know. They just knew, like, okay, these people, like, this is the common denominator here. There was no explanation for why that would be, like, why the blood count would be so high, why that would be the common denominator, any of that stuff. But now, if you will all bear with me, because I absolutely must know, I would like to talk just for a minute about high white blood cell counts. I looked it up, and the Mayo Clinic says that having a high white blood cell count could indicate anything from a small infection to a severe one, bone marrow diseases, immune system issues, or could be caused by things like sudden stress or over-exercising your body. These men didn't do any of those things, and they certainly didn't have any of those things when all of this started. So yes, the stress of war. Okay. Elevated a little, maybe, the stress of this whole thing, but I don't really think that's enough that would make them this sick. I think definitely it had something to do with the lights. Also, the doctors ran tests for those types of things, considering the high white blood cell count, and nothing seemed to be actually physically afflicting the men at all. Everyone was baffled, and again, I say, probably scared too. Despite nothing really officially being wrong with them, the men were all very obviously sick physically and suffering from some mental health and stress issues as well. Almost everyone involved that night blamed the beam of light hovering over them that they opened fire on for no reason other than their own fear and their egos. Sorry, but I said what I said again. Allegedly. According to Wall, many of the men continued to suffer with severe health issues for years after the encounter, and he even said that to that day, the day he was interviewed in 1987, so 36-ish years later, he himself still suffered with bouts of disorientation, memory loss, severe weakness, and difficulty gaining and keeping on any weight. More recently, people believe that the men were more than likely suffering from some sort of radiation sickness or something like that. But again, that doesn't answer the question as to what the craft was, why it was there, what it was doing, what did it do to the men, and then, the most obvious, who was piloting it in the first place? Who was making those decisions behind that craft? So let me just say this. There are also just as many people, myself included, that feel that regardless of whether or not this was radiation sickness, it was at the end of the day exactly what it looked like. It was an attack on human beings by some sort of extraterrestrial craft, beings, and or force. The ship was probably just in the area examining things, as most of us believe nowadays that ETs are very interested in human beings because of the wars we have and how violent we are, and that their reasons, though inscrutable, were probably coming from a place of good in general. I'm not saying that as fact. I'm saying what is most probable to me and to a lot of the sources I've read and people I've spoken to about this in particular, but the whole UFO on the battlefield thing. Because for the most part, we don't see them just coming down and attacking. But we do see them doing things like turning off the military switch for like the nukes and then turning it back on real quick. You know, there's a story about that I want to find to tell you guys. But anyway, all right. All that to say, they weren't looking for trouble or to hurt anyone and were more than likely there to try and help people, if not just observe what was going on. It's been suggested a lot, and I do tend to agree, that the craft didn't mean to launch any sort of fatal attack, but perhaps only meant to immobilize and disorient the men temporarily so that they would stop firing at it. Because the armor-piercing bullets were doing more damage than the freaking artillery fire. The ambush. Remember, the armor-piercing bullets were hitting and having a negative effect on the ship. This makes me think of the missing people in the woods. I'm just saying, bear with me, follow this rabbit hole train of thoughts, and the extreme nausea, weakness, confusion, memory loss, and everything else that these men were suffering from that randomly comes up and comes upon the missing in the woods when they're somehow separated from whoever they went into the woods with. We hear these symptoms time and time again in cases where someone went missing in the woods and was fortunate enough to be found or to find their way back. I mean, if you really think about it, no one died and no one suffered any really serious or life-threatening injuries, objectively. Though admittedly, I would consider what the men had to deal with for the rest of their lives life-altering for sure. This one just remains another in a long list of accounts from people who saw what they saw but can't prove it one way or another, and who now have to live with it and live with how it affects them every single day with no answers, and probably they're never going to get answers. Nothing close to real answers. So, I saved the Vietnam War for last because I went in order of when the wars took place, but also because this war, the Vietnam War in particular, seemed to be plagued, literally, with UFO and extraterrestrial phenomena. The most spectacular of all of the alleged encounters with ETs and UFOs during the Vietnam War seemed to start with encountering a craft of some sort and then actual military engagements of those same UFOs. On June 15th, 1968, along the DMZ, which is a demilitarized zone between North and South Vietnam, a patrol boat known as the PCF-12 that was commanded by a man named Lieutenant Pete Snyder was on a routing night patrol near Cua Viet at around 12:30 in the morning, so just after midnight. At that time, the PCF-12 received a very frantic and hard-to-understand distress call from another patrol boat in the area, the PCF-19. So we have the 12 receiving the distress call from the 19. The PCF-19 told the 12 that they were being attacked by unidentified lights that they were referring to as, quote, enemy helicopters, end quote. That, however, was odd because the Vietnamese were the enemy and they didn't utilize helicopters at all at that time. They had none, didn't use them. So Snyder ordered the PCF-12 to go to the location of the PCF-19 immediately so that they could provide assistance, and that's what the men on 12 did. They did what they were told in order to do. When they started getting close and approaching 19's position, they saw up in the sky 2 circular and very bright lights immersed in a strange glow, hovering directly over where the 19 was positioned. As 12 approached, one of the strange lights emitted a very bright flash of light, and the 19 exploded. It exploded the ship. Immediately following the 19's destruction, the 2 lights began to rapidly accelerate, quote, away towards the sea, end quote, while 12 looked for survivors in the carnage. They were just making their way there, and bam, everything blows up. So what can they do? Find the survivors and help them and hopefully save lives, right? There were 2 men who were found, and although they were wounded, they were still alive, and they did have a very bizarre tale to tell. They said that the two unidentified flying objects had been trailing them for miles along the river. So, of course, they decided as a group that they needed to fire on the non-threatening advancement of the UFOs, and that's what they did. So I would just like to recognize here that while I understand that they were in enemy territory, they were actually in a demilitarized zone. And I understand that they were soldiers who were combat trained in the middle of a war zone, that they were in a designated peace area, that the UFOs had not behaved aggressively or in any kind of threatening manner. And that's according to the witnesses who were there, the two wounded men. And yet their first and initial immediate reaction and instinct was to fire on the ships anyway. I mean, I don't like that. You know, I just don't like that in every single one of these cases, we're firing on UFOs for literally existing. Meanwhile, a lot of us are trying to like prove their existence. So it frustrates me. I do get it. I'm not condemning these soldiers, nor would I ever condemn a soldier from any war. But why? They weren't doing anything. Maybe a preemptive strike, right? Who knows what they would have or could have done. Anyway, ramble done. The men considered them threatening at the time because they didn't know if it was something that the Vietnamese were using to come after them or something like that. So playing devil's advocate to my devil's advocate, I honestly can't confidently tell you how I feel about it all or what I would have done in that situation. I can only sit here and play Monday morning quarterback. So yeah, they opened fire on the ships as they hovered above them, and that's when the 12 approached and saw the one UFO light the 19 up. At first, military officials thought that the 19 had been a victim of some enemy missile fire aimed from the shore, but later on, an AP dispatch from Saigon would quote a military spokesman who said that he attributed the loss of the PCF-19 to, quote, an unidentified object, end quote, and not to enemy coastal missiles or batteries. So immediately after the attack on the 19, the 12 had no choice but to continue its patrol up the river. But it didn't take long for those same two unidentified crafts, those glaringly bright lights, to also approach them. So the UFOs took position on the port and starboard sides around 300 yards away and 100 feet above the water where the ships were. PCF-12 called into headquarters to try and see if anyone knew what it was they were dealing with, so they at least had some idea. But the response they received were that there were no aircrafts in the area at that time at all. The men had obviously realized by then, after what they had just witnessed these things do to the other ship, to the 19, that they weren't friendly and did have the capacity to kill. Snyder ordered his men to take fire at the UFOs, but the rapid fire and everything they had, they threw at them, but it had no effect whatsoever. The attack didn't slow the UFOs down one bit, and it didn't seem to faze them at all. PCF-12 retreated as quickly as they could after attacking the UFOs, and the two mysterious and sinister aircraft stalked and followed them wherever they went, right on their tail the whole time. The lights from the craft were flickering in the darkness of the night the entire time too, and there was a second engine man named Jim Steffs who later said that he got a really good look at the crafts. He described them as having, quote, a rounded front like an observation helo, end quote, like a helicopter, I think it's helo actually, and what appeared to be, quote, two crewmen sitting side by side, end quote. Strangely enough, although there seemed to be no weapons mounted anywhere on the unidentified craft, or at least none that anyone had been able to see or recognize, PCF-12 was nevertheless fired upon. They returned fire. Steph said that he remembered seeing tracer rounds piercing up into the night from the nearby base of Point Doomy, and the crewmen of Point Doomy said that they had been targeting, quote, far-off blinking circular lights whizzing through the sky above them, end quote. It might be Fort Doom, Dumai, I don't know how to pronounce it. Eventually, a group of Phantom F-4 fighter jets arrived, and they converged upon and chased off the strange lights and the craft or crafts they were seemingly attached to. So, in the research and source material, they kind of ambiguously describe the UFOs as one UFO, but with two parts, but they equally refer to it as the craft or the crafts. I think it was one craft, but with two separate compartments, or like it could break off into two or something like that. By that time, the UFOs seemed to be determined to get the PCF-12 further and further out into the sea, but the Phantom F-4s did their job, and the UFOs were finally chased off into the night. However, At exactly the same time as all of the above was going on, another very strange incident was unfolding out in the South China Sea with an allied ship of the Royal Australian Navy called the HMAS Hobart, which was patrolling near Tiger Island, which was about 20 kilometers off of Capley. The Hobart reported sighting up to 30 unidentified slow-moving lights that were hovering in the night sky near the ship, and at first, they were thought to be Russian-built M14 Hound helicopters. However, upon a closer inspection, it could clearly be seen that that is not what they were at all. US-7 Phantom fighter bombers were sent to engage whatever the lights were, and they were supported by very generous anti-aircraft fire from the ground as well. As they were pursued by the fighters, the lights quickly started flying out over the sea, and the fighters, along with several other military ships in the immediate area, followed. Mercilessly and relentlessly, they fired upon the ships the whole time. Unfortunately, it was this incident, though no one ever talks about UFOs when talking about this incident for the most part, that contributed to the friendly fire incident in which a United States Swift boat was sunk by missiles, which killed 5 of the 7 crew on board. The HMAS Hobart was prepared to do battle when the radar room started detecting an unidentified aircraft that was very rapidly incoming on them with no identification number that would tell whether or not it was friend or foe. They soon got word that the craft was friendly. But just at that same time, a missile struck the ship, which killed 1 person and injured 2 others. Whatever the craft was, it fled the scene very quickly and before it could be shot down. In the meantime, F-4 jets were scrambling to try and take the fast-leaving ship down, firing upon the lights again mercilessly, and they were joined by a hail of anti-aircraft fire from the ground again. There were attempts made to communicate with the unidentified aircrafts and whoever it was that was on board, but they never received any answers or responses from the ship. Eventually, after several minutes of chaos, the lights floated far enough off into the night that they can no longer be spotted, and the fighter jets were ordered back to base. The following morning, there was a search that was done because they thought that they had taken down an enemy craft, even if they weren't sure who the enemy was or what type of craft it was, but there was no evidence at all that anything had been damaged or shot down. Not at all. Despite the intense fighting that had taken place and all of the rounds of so many different weapons fired at whatever this thing was, there was nothing to show what it was, where it came from, or whatever else had been going on with it. The complete and utter lack of any wreckage was absolutely baffling because the mysterious craft had come under such resistance and had been met with so much concerted and relentless fire. The Royal Australian Navy later confirmed, quote, "No physical evidence of helicopters destroyed has been discovered in the area of activity, nor has extensive reconnaissance produced any evidence of enemy helicopter operations in or near the DMZ," end quote. Though the public and basically all of the men that were involved were being told that the crafts were some sort of enemy aircraft, the men involved in the fighting battle had little to no confidence that that was in fact the truth. They figured that it had been the case that there should have been an attempt at retaliation and decimation by the, quote, "potent and retaliatory force displayed upon their arrival and attacks," end quote. There were no traces of any helicopters in the area before or after the incident, and no wreckage at all for them to prove that theory anyway. Basically, the men were like, no, it couldn't have been the enemy, because the enemy would have retaliated by now. So what was it? Why didn't it go down? We thought it went down. All of that artillery fire, everything we gave to it, and it just floated off into the night, and you're going to tell us it was the enemy? Okay, they weren't buying it, to say the least. A skipper that had been aboard the Hobart during all of it would later say that there was no way it was enemy helicopters, and he expressed his doubts very vocally by saying, quote, "Neither before nor after the incident was there any report by any of the ships of a helicopter being there around Tiger Island. Now, having said that, the captain of one of the American ships told me later at Subic Bay that he thought there were helicopters there, but the fact is he didn't report. And if he believed there was a helicopter, it was his duty to report it at the time, but there was no report," end quote. Whatever the lights were, they didn't totally disappear that night, and they continued to appear sporadically for months afterwards along the DMZ. They would skirt around the area, wander back and forth across the line, and utterly confuse everyone who saw them. They were sighted by radar up and down the East Coast, but no one ever figured out what they actually were, except that they weren't helicopters. They appeared on the radar to be low, slow-moving objects, showing up much like helicopters would, but there would either be no visible confirmation, or if they did get a glimpse of them, they didn't look anything at all like any helicopter they had ever seen. They also would randomly disappear into thin air, dematerialize, and then materialize again right before everyone's eyes, further confounding the confusion. I mean, jets would quickly move in on them to investigate what they were, but in the short time it took for them to get to the spot where the strange crafts were sighted, there would be nothing there anymore. At no point in time did anyone ever see an actual helicopter, and the strange objects were always described as moving lights, often hovering erratically or moving in sudden bursts of speed that were inconsistent with helicopters. There are so many theories and so much speculation as to what these things were, guys, but honestly, it's just ridiculous, and I'm not going to get into any of them. I'm not going to talk about it. This is somewhat of a famous case, so you can go and look it up for yourself if you're really interested in what the theories are. I wouldn't mind emailing you the details, but if this video gets any longer, I'll have to make it a 2 or 3 parter, which I'm willing to do if you guys want to see more. With all that being said, all that to say, that's all I have for you guys today. Please give this video a big thumbs up if you enjoyed the content, if you enjoyed hanging out with me, if you enjoyed the fact that I probably said DMV instead of DMZ multiple times throughout this video and didn't notice, and when I go back to edit, I'm going to be like, why did you say that? You can't go back now. Spread the love by sharing this video. Subscribe if you haven't already. And I just want to give you guys a big thank you for all the birthday wishes. My birthday is Friday, March 1st. I am going to be the big 4-1. Oh my God. I'm so old, Becky. Guys, thank you so much for the birthday love. Thank you so much. My book, Campfire Stories Volume 2, released on Tuesday, the 27th of February, 2024. Go out and get you a copy, Kindle or paperback, on Amazon. My other books, Missing the Faith Theory, Encounters with Evil, 101 True and Terrifying Tales, that went bestseller. Book number 3, Shadow Entities, Sleep Paralysis and Beyond. Give that book some love, guys. It took me almost 2 years to write. Danger at Your Door, Terrifying Encounters with Black-Eyed Kids, another bestseller. Midnight Visitors, the companion book to the Black-Eyed Kids, Danger at Your Door. That one did really well too. If you want signed autographed copies of any of these, hit me up, GemmaJadeParanormal@gmail.com. Send in your own encounter stories with the supernatural, paranormal, extraterrestrial, otherworldly, so I can put them in the next Listener Encounters video. My newest books, Campfire Stories Volume 1 and Volume 2, available on Amazon as well. The rest of the books that I just named are also available on Audible. All right, leave 5 stars, give really good reviews. Okay, it makes it harder for trolls to be trolling, and it also keeps my book kind of like in the public eye on Amazon. Campfire Stories Volume 2 is a #1 new release on Amazon right now. Let's get it to a #1 bestseller, guys. But to do that, y'all have to purchase it, okay? The Kindle edition specifically is selling very well, and I do appreciate that. If you guys need to contact me for any reason, GemmaJadeParanormal@gmail.com. Guys, if nobody told you today, take it from me. You can accomplish anything you want. You can make your dreams into a reality. All you need to do is believe in the universe, have some faith. I got your back. I believe in you. You need some support? Hit me up. GemmaJadeParanormal@gmail.com. In the description box, you will find ways to donate to the channel. Donations are very important so I can buy equipment and get better and better and better. Right now, I'm trying to get money for a teleprompter so I don't have to read off my screen. That would be great, because the only complaint I ever get, well, 2. 1, I talk too fast sometimes when I get excited, like with this video. But number 2 is that I'm reading and it's annoying. I know, it's annoying to me too, but what am I going to do? Donations, PayPal, Cash App, my Amazon wish list gift link. All right, guys, so hit that up if you can. I also offer personal intuitive oracle readings starting at $20. So check out the description box. There's also the schedule for most weeks. Obviously, things change, things come up, personal things happen. We can't stream for whatever reason, but there are a lot of really amazing live streams on this channel besides Live Intuitive Oracle. Okay, so please check out the description box. There is important stuff. If you care, go on in there, check it out. Be kind to each other, guys. It doesn't cost anything. Be kind to yourselves and never accept anything less than others being kind to you. You're amazing. You got this. Always go in grace. Smile at a stranger. And I'll see you guys next time.